Good to see everyone on a kind of a drizzly October Monday morning. Appreciate you coming. For those of you who don't know me, I am not the keynote speaker today. My name is Scott Nelson, and I have responsibility for the Strategy, Marketing, and Growth Division. And as part of our division, the Center for Advocacy and Philanthropy here at ETS is part of our division as well. And the CAP has responsibility for the Heritage Month celebrations. So to cap our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month this year, we are honored to welcome writer, analyst, and commentator Ruben Navarrette as our keynote speaker. You have his biography there on your chair as you came in, and I suspect it would take me probably close to 10 minutes just to read off the highlights. So as he has been he's had work as a newspaper and magazine reporter and columnist, radio host, editor, and education policy analyst. Let me tell you a little bit about Hispanic Heritage Month and why it's so important to us nationally and us here at ETS. So National Hispanic Heritage Month is an opportunity for all Americans, Hispanic and non-Hispanic, to recognize and celebrate the contributions and culture of Hispanic and Latino Americans. The Latino population in the United States reached 58 million in 2016, and that accounts for about half of the U.S. population growth since 2000. And some of you remember America's Perfect Storm, which was a research report written and issued by ETS in about 2006. And that report predicted exactly that outcome. So Hispanic Americans represent the nation's largest and second fastest growing racial or ethnic group after Asian Americans. They are also the youngest of the major racial and ethnic groups in the United States, with a median age of just 28, just nearly a full decade lower than the U.S. population overall. So politically, some 28 million Latinos are eligible to vote. That's up from 23.3 million just since 2012. Educationally, an area of keen interest obviously to us here at ETS, the Hispanic high school dropout rate has significantly declined, and college enrollment has increased. However, Hispanic Americans trail other groups in earning a bachelor's degree. So almost 40% of Hispanics ages 25 and older had some college experience in 2015, up from 30% in year 2000, but they still lag other groups in obtaining the 4-year degree. So Ruben Navarrette, close observer of the educational opportunities, the Hispanic Americans, and the power of education to improve lives. The title of his presentation today is The Recipe for Educating Latino Students: High Expectations, Hard Work, and Holding Everyone Accountable.
Please give Ruben a very warm ETS welcome.
Well, Scott had done his homework. He's already. Let me see, how's this? Is that on now? Okay, great. Well, it's, I can see already I'm in the right place with the right message on the right day, speaking to the right people. I go around the country and I sometimes have to explain to people, and sometimes they're asking me questions about the significance of the Latino community. You know, why does it matter? Why do we have something like Hispanic Heritage Month? Why did the White House almost 30 years ago put together an initiative specifically targeting Hispanic education? And part of it has to do with the numbers. And we'll get to that in a second, but it's good to be in a room full of people who deal with numbers and statistics and understand the significance and the significance of the report, A Perfect Storm, in 2006. It saw this coming. It brought back a memory. I'll get to that in terms of my first trip to ETS many years ago, but it brought back a memory of where I think I started to think about this stuff, and it was probably way back in the 80s, and it was in part because of ETS and its partnership with the College Board. So let me begin at the beginning, as I say, in terms of a little bit more onto my introduction and particularly how I relate to this audience and this town and this institution. My times in Princeton, I was first here in Princeton, New Jersey, as a high school senior when my mom and dad brought me out to visit Princeton University along with a couple of other Ivy League schools. And it was a whole new world coming from Central California, where I came from, the grandson of farm workers, the son of a cop. It was a new world for all of us, and we got a chance to see the university, go up the road to see Yale, go up the road to see Harvard. And years later, I would come back to Princeton, and specifically to ETS, when in the summer of 1988, I was working at the College Board. And the board has, obviously, this relationship with ETS, and they said, well, today you're going to get on a train and go down to ETS for a series of meetings, and I did. I got on the train at Penn Station, got off here, and was at ETS, and this was many years ago. It was 1988. I was 21 years old. I'm now not 21 years old anymore. As evidence by the fact I was nursing this pulled muscle because my son, who is 11 years old and plays baseball, is not at all respectful of the fact that he has an older father. Doesn't defer to me in the least, doesn't cut me any slack. So we were playing ball the other day, and I did something I shouldn't have done and stretched something I shouldn't have stretched. But even that could not keep me away from all of you here today. So I'll look back on the themes of the work I've done, the experiences I've had, the stuff that I've written about in these many years. I write a lot about three topics in particular: immigration, media, and politics. And if you did a word search and you found among the 2,000 columns, op-eds, and essays that I've written over the years, over 3 million printed words over the last 25 to 26 years, you'd see a lot on immigration, media, and politics. But education is bigger than all of that for me. Education is the one subject that's always been there for me, that I cared about first, that I wrote about first, that I thought about first, that I studied first. It was there at the beginning. It was there before I ever knew I wanted to be a journalist. Education was there first. And as I said, it was part of the reason I went to work for the College Board. Don Stewart was the president of the College Board at the time. And they brought me in. I was there for the summer. Because I was 21, I wanted to spend the summer in New York City. And I said, let me find a good job to do that. And it was the College Board was the job. And they had a project for me. Among other things I did that summer, there was a project regarding a kit. This is what I remember about it. It was a kit that was developed by ETS and by the College Board, specifically targeting Hispanic students to help them take the PSAT, okay? So it was well-intentioned, but I would learn at the time that it gets a little complicated in terms of how you implement a really good, well-intentioned idea, okay? And in the case of Latinos, we'll get to that in a second. For those of you who understand marketing and deal in marketing, you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. It became complicated because Latinos don't necessarily like to be marketed on the nose. In other words, Latino youth in particular, they drive the folks on Madison Avenue crazy because it's very difficult to market to them. If you market something as Latino something, they might just shy away from it and say, I want to be pigeonholed that way. I like what I like. On the other hand, they'll find themselves to very generic products that are acceptable to the mainstream. They'll go to Twitter, they'll devour Facebook or whatever it is, Instagram, Snapchat. So they go sort of those things. And we know this because when NBC Latino launched, they thought, if you're Latino, you'll go to NBC Latino. Not understanding that many Latinos who speak Spanish or Spanish dominant are going to go to Univision and Telemundo, and many who are English are going to go to plain old NBC. So there was no space for NBC Latino. So suddenly there is no NBC Latino. Okay, it goes bankrupt. There are other examples of people who are marketing on the nose in media, and if you stick the word Latino on there, it gets very, very complicated. Sometimes it's the death knell, right? So the Latino kit meant well, but it was perhaps, now this is way back in '88, it was perhaps a little off mark in terms of how receptive the students would be to it, because Latino students want more than anything not to be set aside, not to be thought as different, not to be told, we have this special accommodation for you because, you're frankly not equipped to be able to take the PSAT like those kids on the other side of the class, your friends, people who live on the other side of town. So we mean well again, but you have this kind of, attempt to set them apart that they resist. So anyway, this was my takeaway from the time. I'm also, in terms of education, I should say that I'm pro-test. It's a good thing to say when you're at ETS. I'm pro-test. I'm pro-test because, for a lot of reasons. I'm pro-test because when you poll Latino parents and ask them how they feel about testing, they're in favor of testing more than mainstream parents. Okay? White parents, on whole, when you ask them about testing, they'll say, well, you know, I'm concerned that schools are teaching to the test, and there's so much the test can't measure, and we need to be able to look at students holistically. All fine arguments. Latino parents are a little different. They want to know what their kids know, and they want to know what their kids don't know. And they don't have a lot of time because they're on the clock. And they feel like they work really hard, 16 hours a day, and they're putting everything on the idea that if their kids do well in school, one day their kids will have a better, softer life. So they have a really high-stakes game going here. And so if they don't understand something, they want you to understand, they want you to know that their kids are not these little delicate flowers that are going to wilt. If you come down hard on them, fine. Because believe me, at home, we come down hard on them as well. And this is kind of the immigrant tradition. Okay? It's true of immigrant families. My friends from India, my friends from China, my friends from Mexico, they all say the same thing. Okay? Test my kid to know what they know. Once we find out what they don't know, teach them what they don't know. Okay, makes sense. In the context of the debate we had over No Child Left Behind, however, in the public schools, all that got turned around. And the debate sort of became, you know, this idea that somehow public schools were pushing back against the idea of testing. Now, to be fair, they were pushing back against the idea of high-stakes testing. The idea that you would have testing with a consequence attached to it, whereby if schools didn't test well, okay, register good scores for their students, you could withdraw funding. But years later, when Barack Obama took office, and he chose Arne Duncan as his Secretary of Education, Duncan and Obama came forward with something called Race to the Top, which was a way of rebranding No Child Left Behind. I've covered politicians for 25 years, okay? I know all about politicians at every level. And one of the games they play is they take Coke, they make it into new Coke, they sell the new Coke, they create an demand for the old Coke, and then bring the old Coke back, right? So you end up with policies that are very similar from year to year. Race to the Top was a rebranded effort at No Child Left Behind. Didn't we just do that recently with NAFTA? We did, right? President Trump says it's not NAFTA, it's now, you know, okay. But it's got the same three partners, many of the same components. It's rebranded NAFTA. New Coke. So in this case, with Race to the Top, Obama and Duncan basically said, we're going to likewise find out how the schools are doing, and we're not going to offer the stick, we're going to offer a carrot. We're going to give them money as an incentive if they do well. It's like merit pay on a grand scale, right? But instead of it going to individual teachers, it's going to go to districts. But how are you going to find out if they're doing well? You're going to have to test them. So it was the same thing, liberal, Democrat, conservative, Republican, both pushing the idea of testing to figure out who knows what. So I'm pro-test. I was talking not long ago, I do work for the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas. We were at a meeting talking about education policy. The former president was there. He still doesn't get and understand, and neither do I, the sort of gut level resistance to testing. He says, if a child doesn't know how to read, how do you know they don't know how to read unless you give them a reading test? And my philosophy has been, if you have a problem with the test, you don't throw out the thermometer because the patient has a fever. You give a thermometer to the patient, oh, there's a fever. You don't throw out the thermometer. You fix the fever. You treat the patient, right? But testing, and by extension ETS, becomes sort of an easy and convenient villain because there are a lot of folks out there, I'll tell you a little secret here, who are afraid of how well their kids will test, okay? I live in San Diego, in a suburb, and my neighbors and I live in homes that are very expensive. And we all know that. And we know that because we're working all the time to pay for those homes. And I don't see my neighbors because they're all traveling around the country. These poor guys, right? Everybody works. Everybody's traveling. Everybody's working hard. And the idea is that we bought these homes because some real estate agent someplace told us that the school in our neighborhood, the elementary school in our neighborhood where all our kids are supposed to go, is a really good school. And my school district, Carlsbad Unified, is a really good school district. And if you send your kid to that school, they'll do well, do well, do well, and one day they'll go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. They'll go to these great schools. And so all these parents go in hawk for these $1 million homes, okay? Work ourselves into an early grave. Why? Got to send the kid to that school? The day that they do the testing at that school, and they come back with the results, and they put it in the paper, in a big sheet, and they lay out exactly how well the kids are doing, oh man. Suddenly a lot of parents are upset and concerned and confused, and they're demanding a refund. Wait a minute, I'm paying $1 million for this home, working myself into an early grave, working 16 hours a day to send my kid to that school, and the test scores came back, don't look so good. Suddenly the school district is nervous, the teachers union is nervous, the superintendent is nervous. Superintendent's like, I'm making $200,000 a year, making $250,000. The last thing I want to do is move again. Superintendents have to move every 2 years. Superintendent says, if I move one more time, my wife's going to divorce me, okay? Or kill me. Superintendent says, we have to do everything we can to make sure, one, we keep the scores out of the paper. Two, that we either don't test the kids or find some way to discredit the test if the numbers come back low. All of a sudden, everybody's throwing away the thermometer, okay? Politics, education, money, it's kind of all wrapped up in one little ball. And it drives this notion that somehow testing bad, ETS bad. No, testing not bad, okay? What's bad is the educational inequality and the lack of a quality education that's coming through the testing, that the testing is revealing. What the test reveals is the problem, not the test itself. So I'm thinking about where I was, where I am now, and what happened along the way. Where I was mostly preoccupied with education, mostly determined when I worked at the College Board that I wanted to become a teacher or work in the educational space somehow, that I wanted to become a lawyer. I went to Harvard to become a lawyer. Where those two areas intersected, to my mind, was in the field of education law. I took a course in my senior year in college at the law school called Education in the Law, Schools in the Law, it was called. It was taught by Jay Herbert, who's a old friend and professor of mine who now teaches at Columbia, but he taught at Harvard at the time. And it was all about the intersection between the law and the schools, the rights, constitutional rights of teachers and students and the like. I loved it. I loved it, okay? There were courses at Harvard where I did not do so well. This was not one of them. I love this course. And it was fun. I thought I could make a living here. I could be a lawyer who deals in the education space. I could work for school districts. I could go work for ETS. Or I could go out and sue school districts if I thought they weren't doing right by the students. So I decided, in really true ambitious Harvard student kind of way, that what I would do is go off and pursue a law degree and a doctorate in education, which is what Herbert had. Jay had both. And I thought, okay, so I'll go do both. And mainly I wanted to do that because I wanted to make sure that other students had the same opportunity I had. That I felt already I was sort of figuring out when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, that not every Mexican-American kid who grows up in the farm country of San Joaquin Valley in California eventually goes to Harvard. And a lot of the friends that I knew and grew up with, I felt had gotten the short end of the stick. They'd been shortchanged by the educational system, and I wanted to know why. So I began to take education courses at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and began to study more about education, had the job at the College Board, had other summer jobs in the education space, and began to sort of learn that the educational system is broken. And it's broken because of several things. One of the big headlines that came out to me was low expectations. The idea that not all students are assumed to be capable at the same level. And that there are assumptions and prejudices that say that if you go to a big fancy school in the center of California, where I'm from, some $30 million high school, a $30 million high school with a big gigantic swimming pool that looks like a college campus, that automatically you're gonna get a better education and you're gonna be more likely to go to the Ivy League than if you went to a, quote, poorer school, okay? So these are assumptions that we buy into, and there's a basic inequity there, and it bothered me. So I decided maybe the way to fix it was to go through the law. Now, eventually I find my way to becoming a journalist, because in the middle of studying for those 2 degrees I talked about, I really wanted to tell a story that was bubbling up inside of me about my own educational experience at Harvard. And I felt a great sense of unease. It can be described as sort of survivor's guilt, because I did keep track of my friends back home, and I did realize that they didn't have the same educational experience I did. And it became difficult to go back home again because we were from different worlds and we'd learned different things. And I missed home, and I was homesick, and it was cold and raining in Cambridge, and snowing and sleet. And there was no Spanish. It was 1985, 86, 87, 88. No Mexican food to speak of, okay? I was in hell, in other words. So all my friends and I, Latino friends and I, we were homesick. To give you an idea, there were 2,000 freshmen in my my graduating class, or my entering class at Harvard. In the fall of '85, there were 2,000 freshmen, and 35 of us were Mexican American. 35 out of 2,000. And those 35 were generally homesick. So I thought that as a way of sort of bridging the gap between home and Harvard, I would try to expand the educational opportunity for everybody. And it led me to this idea of writing about my experience. So I wrote a book at a young age, at 24, 25. And I remember walking into to the Harvard Career Services office, and the woman there saying, "What can I do for you?" And other people had said, "I want help, with the LSAT or the GRE, or I want help to go into business school or law school or whatever." And I said, "I want help writing a book." I was 23 years old. And she said, "Well, what do you want to write a book about?" And I said, "I want to write a book about my experience in school, in high school and in grade school and in college. So I want to write my memoir." I think she said memoir. And she goes, "Oh, so you want to write your memoir?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm 23 years old." So even at a place like Harvard, that was a little bit too much. But I did eventually graduate, and I went and enrolled, and when I was at UCLA in my double program, I got this book deal, and I wrote a book, and that changed everything. I just kept writing. So now here I am. I never left education behind, though. And I now have decided that the way to affect policy is to analyze what's going on, propose effective solutions, talk to educators, talk to the experts, find out how they would create a more perfect system, which is what I try to do. The title of today's program is The Recipe for Latino Education, Successful Latino Education, how to broaden the educational attainment of Latino students in America. It starts with, and it always goes back to, a three-legged stool. And that's, on the one hand, the schools, which I would include the teachers, the principals, to some degree, school board members and superintendents, but the public school itself, let's say. The second leg of the stool is the parents who have to be there and ready for business and have to make sure their kids are doing homework. The days that they're challenged at school, they have to side with the teacher and not with the student. You can't have the teacher fighting with the parent or vice versa. You need to have them as a united front, convincing the student that they have to be there for business. And the third element of the stool is obviously the student itself. And the student has to be there for business. And the student has to realize there's no shortcuts. There's no easy way out. Hard work is what it takes. They have to decide, I'm here and I want to go here. I grew up in a little small town, 10,000 people in farm country. There were two ways to get out. You join the Marines or you go away to college. So I went away to college. And you need to have some sort of a push. The student has to be there ready for business. It's what drove me, was to get out. I was motivated by a desire to run away from home. And interestingly enough, you get older and suddenly you try to find a way to run back. But at 18, I wanted to run away from home. I would add, in addition to those three legs of the stool, one more thing. And that's an overhaul of the system, the educational system, so that we're not convinced to just save the few. We really think we should save them all. We think we should really save as many as possible and not just be content with saving the few. In my book, A Darker Shade of Crimson, I talk about a phrase, intra-racial differentiation. And all that really means is, in a school that was mostly Latino, mostly Mexican and Mexican-American, there were some Mexican-American kids who were seen as equipped and capable and ready to go to Stanford and Harvard and Berkeley and schools like this, and others that were going to go to jail. others who were going to work in menial jobs or eventually end up dropping out of school or eventually end up in jail. And that's kind of how it went. And so that began to bother me because I was interested in how it is that you end up in one pile and not the other. So I think for too long, our educational system has been content to educate the few and not the many. We see it in the African American community. We see it in the Latino community. Both of these communities get sort of mixed messages because on the one hand, you have these marks of success. You have an African American president, you have African American celebrities and movie stars and a good amount of African American wealth that's been created. You have Latinos popping up on the big screen in entertainment and the like and in politics. But under that, you have the vast majority, the average Latino or African American kid in elementary school. And they're not part of that, right? They're not going to become, Aaron Hernandez, and they're not going to become Selena Gomez, and they're not going to become Jay-Z, and they're not going to become Beyonce. And it's confusing, I think, for a lot of young people because they see these things happening, but they're not a part of it. So that's one of the things I think we need to overhaul as well, that system. I think it gets me to one of the most dangerous isms facing America today. Right now, I don't think we're facing what we're facing in racism, ethnocentrism, nativism is anything compared to the big one, which is elitism. Elitism. Elitism within the minority communities, elitism in American society as a whole. I think about where it comes from. I had a chance to talk about elitism in a very appropriate place 2 years ago. I was invited to go back to Harvard to speak, and I was talking about elitism, and I thought, I look out on Harvard Yard, and I think back, this is home for me. This is where I feel most comfortable. But this is like Disneyland. I said, I come to see this is not the real world. And the real world is Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and all these states, where people may see the world differently. And I think that elitists aren't born, but they're made. And I think elitism isn't just about money. In fact, it's not all about money, at all about money. It's about things like educational attainment, the people you associate with, the magazines you read, the television shows you listen to. Why I listen to NPR and I watch PBS. And I would never vote for Trump. In fact, you know what? I don't know a single person who voted for Donald Trump, I'm proud to say. Okay? I think if you're a journalist in America and you can say that on television, that phrase, and proudly, you ought to be fired. Okay? Because we should not be paying you if you can't understand America. I didn't ask you to go vote for the guy. I didn't ask you to support the guy. I just want you to understand why other people voted for the guy. And if you're a journalist and you're smarter than anybody, and you go on television to make us all know that you're smarter than everybody else, you need to be able to understand why people in Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin voted for Trump. And what I find interesting about places like Harvard is they take kids out of Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and they bring them to Cambridge, and they immerse them in that whole world. They create some amount of alienation from their home, from their family and the like. It's an unintentional consequence, right? It happens. And they sort of tell them that those people back there are backward, they're not smart, they're bigoted, they're closed-minded, whatever. And then one day you graduate, and you decide you want to go home. So you take your Harvard degree, and you want to go back to Michigan because you want to run for Congress. And you can't get elected, and you don't want to know why. Why can't you get elected? Because you don't understand those people anymore, right? I should have a class at every elite university in America, how to relate to your hometown. How to go home again. And it starts with not looking down on those people, okay? This morning I was watching Morning Joe. I don't want to get too far down this road, but it's too bad. You bring a journalist to talk, and inevitably the word Trump's going to come out of his mouth. I don't mean to do that, because there's plenty of talk about absent that. However, I want to make a point about elitism. I was watching Morning Joe this morning, and our media is broken because I was watching CNN, and they were talking about how the Democrats are going to win all these House races, and I flipped over to Fox News, and they were talking about how the Republicans are going to retain the Senate. And everybody seemed happy and cheerful, and nobody wanted to cover the other story, right? But on Morning Joe, they were talking about how the president doesn't read. And Mika was making a jab at Trump, saying he's not very smart, he doesn't read, not very smart, doesn't read. And I thought, geez. I thought, first of all, the guy was smart enough to win the White House. He was smart enough to beat Hillary Clinton. And the Democratic Party was smart enough to find the one person in America who could lose to Donald Trump. And I thought to myself, as someone who would like to see a change in leadership at the White House, I would. I don't want them to roll the dice on this again. You know, they already tried insulting the basket of deplorables once and didn't work out so well. I would just like for Democrats to go back into those 4 states that helped elect Trump, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and just present an economic message. Just learn how to bring back those Democrats that voted for Trump. Stop insulting people. Stop looking down your nose at people. If you want a guy in Michigan to vote for your guy, don't go to the guy in Michigan and say, you don't read, you're deplorable, you're a bigot, you hate Mexicans. No, vote for me. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. So I'm frustrated, a little frustrated, because I don't think this is a winning formula. But that's elitism. Talked about the Hispanic community. I just want to go over a few statistics to jump on what Scott said. It's true that you have 58 million Latinos in the country. They're 19% of the population right now. They're on their way to 25%. In 20 years, they'll be 25% of the entire country. That's Iowa and everybody. The entire population of the United States, 25% Hispanic. They represent right now $1.8 trillion in buying power. They're present in all 50 states. They're the swing vote politically. They frustrate. I told you how Latinos frustrate folks on Madison Avenue. They also frustrate folks on K Street in Washington. Politically, Latinos are complicated people, okay? We are registered Democrats who have shown a willingness to vote Republican for specific Republicans, but not for other Republicans. We are conservative by nature, but at the same time, we believe there's a big role for government to play in lots of issues. We have a GDP of $2.13 trillion that's growing at 70% faster than the non-Latino GDP, okay? Because of the growth in Latino businesses and the like. We would be the 7th largest economy in the world if it were a country, larger than India. India is 2.09 trillion, and again, the Latino number is 2.13 trillion. These numbers come to me by something called the Latino Donor Collaborative, which is a group of very successful Latino businessmen who've gotten together, businessmen and women, who've gotten together and have made it their mission to explain to America how important this population is. My brother, who went to Berkeley and went to work in Hollywood, is in the field of marketing promotions, and he deals with social influencers. I didn't know what social influencer was, which tells you I'm old. But apparently a social influencer, a new way of marketing and promoting products, particularly in Hollywood, it plays on the fact that Latinos are very prominent in media, sports, entertainment, the world of politics and business. We're everywhere, every single place. We're in every story, every big story that's out there, be it the OJ trial years ago or the Kavanaugh hearings most recently. Just wait, you will hear a Latino surname pop up there somewhere. We are not very well represented in folks in the area of media and politics in terms of the people you see on air or the people you see in office, but we are very well represented in the work of media and the work of politics. We add 500,000 new eligible voters every year, people who turn 18. That's 2 million voters every 4 years, and we, I think, clocked in at about 12 million voters in 2016. Why does all this matter? Why does it matter that this population of people be educated and well-educated? One good reason, Social Security. In the year 2038, 20 years from now, all those kids who are in kindergarten now, who are 5 years old, will be 25. Right now, in the average kindergarten classroom, 1 in 4 of those kids is Latino. 1 in 4, 25%, right? So you have a heavy Latino population. As Scott was saying, we index younger. So 1 in 4 kindergarten kids is Latino. In 20 years, when that kid is 25 years old and in the workforce, you'll have boomers, perhaps elsewhere. You have Xers, retired, and millennials, and the iGen generation as workers. The iGen generation, the young kids now, as workers, pumping money into Social Security. The entire system will be in difficulty if you are not training people to become high-wage earners. If they're not going to become high-wage earners, if they're going to be low-wage earners, the entire system is going to be in great difficulty. You ask Latinos to name their top 3 issues, politically and just in general. And this may surprise some of you, immigration is not one of them. Immigration is an issue we care a lot about, we fight a lot about, and we get provoked about. But the top 3 issues typically come back in polling: healthcare, jobs in the economy, and education. Education. Education is a local issue that Latinos nonetheless think should be a national priority. A national priority. Why? Because we value education above all else. And we teach our kids to respect teachers like they do policemen and priests and other authority figures. Because we know why. We know that education changes people's lives. It did in my case. My parents graduated from high school in 1959, 1962, respectively. My dad at the bottom of his class in 59. My mom in the middle of her class in 62. The same high school that I went to in 85, my brother and sister went to later. And I graduated at the top of my class, my parents at the bottom of theirs. You begin to think why that happened. And in my case, it happened because if you trace it all the way back to 3rd grade, I remember being involved in something called ability grouping. They used to call it ability grouping or tracking. In the old days, they'd have blue birds and red birds and yellow birds. This goes way back. This was the 70s, and what my teacher had in 3rd grade were different shapes. So she had the circle group, the triangle group, the square group, the rectangle group, and I was in the most complicated group. I was in the hexagon group. Right? So you got 30 kids, and you have to measure that somehow, navigate that, manage that somehow. So the way she decided to do it, and it was pretty common at the time, you take 6 kids per group, 5 groups, or the other way around, 5 groups, and 5 kids per group, 6 groups, and each group has a different book, different reading book in one class. So immediately the kids can discern which book is which, right? Because the kids who are in the more complicated book can look to see the other kids have a different book. I remember that book. I had that book 2 years ago. But now I have this one, right? So before long, the 3rd graders figure out who the smart kids are and who the not so smart kids are. And that's an oversimplification, but we're talking about 3rd graders. It's how they see the world. And one thing about that hexagon group, even though my town was 70 to 80% Hispanic, I was the only Hispanic hexagon. There were, say, 5 of us, for argument's sake, 5 of us. Those 5, 4 white kids and me, we all went to, sure enough, this is 3rd grade. If you play it all the way forward, 1 went to Harvard, 1 to the Naval Academy, 2 to Stanford, maybe 1 to Berkeley. That's where the hexagons went. At the other end of the spectrum were the circles, all Latino, okay? Some of them dropped out of school. Some graduated at the bottom of the class. Some never went to college. Some went to jail. So I saw myself in 3rd grade as one of the smart kids. Later in 6th grade, I get put into, they say you're going to go into 7th grade now, and we're going to make some recommendations. They're asking the 6th grade teacher to choose who should go into pre-algebra, the math course. And so she picks some people, and she picks me. And I'm one of them, and I go. So in 7th grade, I show up in pre-algebra. That's important because if you're in 7th grade pre-algebra, that means you're going to be in 8th grade algebra, 9th grade geometry, 10th grade advanced algebra. Yes, and then 3rd grade trig, math analysis. I still don't know what math analysis is, I swear. Yeah, I blocked that out. I blocked trigonometry out, and calculus. So senior year, I'm in calculus, right? We have a graduating class of 450 kids in my school, and there are 25 kids in the calculus class. That's it, 1 calculus class, AP calculus. Of that class, there may have been 5 of us who were Latino, 5 Mexicans out of the 25. So you see how this is going, right? They're content to sort of save a few. They can't save them all, so they're going to save a few. And eventually, that's how it goes. And those people in that calculus class and that AP class, they go off and go to good colleges. I had 5 AP courses my senior year. I had one AP course my junior year. I had 5 hours of homework every single night my senior year. That was it. My mom would come in sometimes. Later when I wrote my book, I'm getting ahead, but when I wrote my book, you know, one of the themes is I feel guilty, I feel guilty, I feel guilty, I'm a survivor, I feel guilty. And my mom, who graduated in the middle of her class, but sort of majored in common sense, right, who has a PhD in common sense, she said, you know what, you need to stop beating yourself up over this, because I remember many times when you were in high school, I'd get up, you know, to check the house or something, and it's 1 a.m. And I go up and there's a light on in your room, and I go over and you're asleep on your desk, sprawled out on a book, okay? She goes, and I would wrestle you up to put you to sleep, put you to bed. Many times, right? Many times. So I get a lot of Latinos sometimes who say, you know, I want what you want. You know, Ruben has 2 Harvard degrees, I want 2 Harvard degrees. My response is, that's cool, but guess what? They don't hand those things out in Cracker Jack boxes. You have to work your ass off. You have to work your ass off in high school to get there, and in college to get to the next step, and there to go to the next step. And I'm still working. And that's the message we have to give to young people, right? Hard work. So that was my educational experience. As I said, then I went on to graduate school and found my way into journalism. To close, as I get back to the recipe, I get back to what I've picked up from educators. But the reason I like what I do is because I'm really curious, and I like asking questions. And so rather than pretend that I know what's like in a classroom right now, I've been a teacher. I was a full-time teacher and a substitute teacher. I was a substitute teacher in my old school district for 5 years, where I taught at the K through 12 level, and I taught full-time at the junior high level. That was some hard duty. That was some very interesting duty. I've had various things in my life to humble me, a lot of humility. That was one of those things. Another thing was when I graduated from Harvard, I said I needed some humility, so I went to go teach kindergarten, where I had a lot of 5-year-old kids who were not impressed by where I went to school. And then I taught the junior high level, as I said, and I taught them at a long-term for a semester. And that was part of my experience. But I don't know what goes on in public schools today. So what I do is I pick up the phone and I call people I know who are educators now, teachers, and ask them. And I called them up recently, a number of Latino educators, and I asked them a simple question. I said, you're king for a day. You could do anything you want to revamp the system. And here's the goal. Increase the educational attainment of Latino students. Go. What would you do? They gave me a list. I'll go through them quickly. One said, you gotta focus on early reading. These are teachers, former teachers, current teachers, administrators. Early reading K through 3. If you get that right, it's all gonna fall into place. If you do not, it's not gonna fall into place. You're gonna be struggling with it. We'd like more flexibility, someone said, in contracts with teachers. This was an administrator at the district office. Former teacher. More flexibility in contracts with teachers. As it is now, I have a contract that says the teacher works from 8 till 3. They only work from 8 to 3. They don't work till 3:30. I'd like to have more flexibility in my contracts with teachers, okay? More flexibility in how we spend our funds, okay? That's one of the schools that kids love charter schools. People love charter schools sometimes because they get less money, but they get more flexibility in how they can use it. A lot of public schools would like to have more flexibility in how they use their funds. Another thing they said they want was a culture of high expectations for everybody. No more low expectations for anybody. And no more being content with just the few folks that end up in the lifeboat. Another person said accountability. Accountability at all parts of the system. And that old saying that when nobody's accountable, and everybody's accountable, nobody's accountable, right? So when I was going to school, if kids were successful, teacher said, well, that's me, I did a great job, I'm a good teacher. Kid didn't do so well, that's not my fault, it's the parents' fault. Educators pivot and they blame the parents. I'm only responsible for success, failure, parents. So there was no sense of accountability. Now more and more I see models where they have a greater sense of accountability. When something's going astray, when student's going off track, they trace back that student to everybody who taught them, and they get it right. It's not with a stick to beat up everybody, but it's really a sense of holding everybody accountable, Okay, good. One person said we need to change the way we think about education. We have a lot of teachers who aren't paid enough. They can't live in the districts in which they're working. We should have special home loans for teachers at low interest to say we really value education and teaching as a profession. Notice that's a little different than the typical response from the 60s and 70s, throw more money at the schools. Here they're not saying that. They're saying throw more money at the teacher, not at the schools. Right? Who knows? Nobody knows where the money went when it went to the schools. It didn't always go to the classroom or the teachers. They said recognizing that kids learn differently. I left out that my wife's a teacher. Kind of buried the lead there, didn't I? My wife is a Montessori trained teacher. She's a language therapist who works with kids who have dyslexia. So she's a reading specialist and she helps kids who have dyslexia. And I came from public schools, so I know nothing about dyslexia. And the 15 years I've been with my wife, she's taught me a lot about how people process information differently. The public schools are not equipped for that. We have some really smart kids who are high functional dyslexics. We don't know how to handle that. In the public schools, we don't. They end up in special ed. They end up having to go to other private schools. There's a school in Dallas where you can send your second or third grader who has dyslexia to that school, and they do a great job. It's $20,000 a year. It's $20,000 a year, and people pay it because everybody there has dyslexia. It's just for that, right? And so there is a need for that because people are wired differently. They process information differently. We know this. Also, they said enhance the partnership between teachers, parents, and students. Okay, as I said before, make sure that's a strong partnership. Nobody blames anybody. Nobody gets to point the finger at anybody. Nobody gets to work against anybody. Okay, the minute that the two of them are ganging up against one, the triangle has to work really everybody fairly and in concert with one another. And then you have the last one, which is, this is a big one. They said the whole nature of counseling has changed over the years. For me, a guidance counselor in 1985 at Sanger High School was the person you went to if you need to change a class or you want information about going to college. That's it. Today, in elementary schools, in junior high schools, and in high schools, the counselor is where you go for grief counseling, for emotional support, to behavioral issues. Mom and dad have problems. Where I live in San Diego, true story, kids will go in and say, why are you crying? My dad was deported last night. You know, my dad was here in the country legally, and he's deported. It could be drug issues, it could be alcohol issues, it could be anything. So all of a sudden now, my educators tell me what they need more and more in our public schools, more of those types of counselors. And there are some now, and they're in great demand. It's a huge field that's growing, unfortunately. So let me wrap up with this. And I'll end where I started in terms of Latinos and the significance. The reason this is a significant population, it values education. We've explained why. It's important that this is a well-educated population. But I didn't say this would be easy. Because as I said before, Latinos are a confusing group. They're both liberal and conservative. They're proud of their culture, but they're also very much assimilated. They don't like to be marketed on a nose, but they do like to be acknowledged as their differences. There are different groups within the Latino community, and there's 58 million people. You have Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans and Mexican Americans. The biggest part of that pie is Mexican/Mexican American at about 65% of the overall. And even within that population of Mexican American, there's differences. I know this firsthand. I live this firsthand because I'm Mexican American. That means I'm of Mexican heritage, but I'm American. I see the world as an American. I'm an American through and through. You know, I'm an American Mexican, right? Yankee Doodle Dandy. I was born in the United States. Both my parents were born in the United States, and 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in the United States. The 4th one came from the Mexican, during the Mexican Revolution, from Mexico. Came legally because you couldn't come illegally until much later. That's my story. My wife, on the other hand, is Mexican. Born in Guadalajara, Mexico, came here as a child. Again, legally came as a child with her family members. You ask my kids, who are 9, 11, and 13, so what about Daddy? What's Daddy? And they sit there with this confused look on their face, and they're like, well, Dad is well, let's see, he was born in Fresno in California, and he's American, but he's also from, his grandparents were from Mexico, and he says it's really important to know that you're Mexican, but he doesn't speak Spanish, he only speaks English. It's all very confused. And they say, I think that daddy is an American. And then they ask, what's mommy? And they come back immediately and say, she's Mexican. That's the joke, right? Mom knows she's Mexican. Dad is this confused muddle called Mexican American. So there's differences, all that. We have similarities to African Americans in many respects. A history of being discriminated against, a history in the Southwest even of being lynched in Texas by the Texas Rangers, and other moneyed interest. You have a terrible history resembling sort of Jim Crow. Instead of signs in the South said no black people or dogs allowed, they had restaurants in the Southwest that had signs that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed. So you have similarities to the African American experience. And you have similarities to the Irish American experience because we're Catholic, an immigrant population, discriminated against, and the like. Also, like the Irish also have a confused way of approaching their identity. They are fiercely proud to be Irish, but that doesn't get in the way of being American. And that's very comparable to, again, the Latino experience. So that much is all confusing, but this is what we know, and this is what is clear, and this is what has always been clear in the 30 or 40 years I've written about education. Latinos value education above all else. If you hear somebody talking, some teacher talking about how Latino parents don't value education, that's your tell that they don't know what the hell they're talking about. You should not listen any further to that person, okay? If they say Latino parents don't value education, that's your signal to tune them out because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. I don't care where they went to school. I don't care how many PhDs they have. I don't care if they have their teacher's credential. They don't know what they're talking about. We value education above all else. We realized early on that our interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the educational system. Teachers' unions and Latino parents do not have the same interests. We're not afraid of testing, as I said before. We're concerned about what the test may reveal, but we're not afraid of testing. We believe accountability is key, holding everybody accountable, including us and including our kids. We know that low expectations are a problem, and maybe the center problem. And then we also know what the solution is. It's hard work. There's no shortcut. There's no easy way. If you want something out of life, you have to work hard to get it. Latinos know that already. That's why they get up every morning and go to work long hours, work on weekends, work 2-3 jobs. Those Latino parents already know that. They've already figured out that the secret to life is hard work. So they want you to likewise work hard. They want us all to work hard so that their kids get a chance at a better life. It's a really important job. We all have a role to play in it. So I thank you very much for your role in it, what you do every day. Thank you for having me.
We have some time for questions, and I think there are microphones around. And we have people remote, so please wait for the microphone.
What does holding people accountable look like? In particular, you've talked about troubleshooting, whether it's the parents or the teachers or the students in a particular situation, but do you have another example or a more general formula for what does accountability look like?
That's a good question. I have my own answer to that, and then first let me give you the answer that I got from my old school district. Sanger Unified School District in the middle of California made a really big turnaround recently. It became one of the better school districts in the state, and I was interested as to what happened there at my old school district. So I called over and spoke to the superintendent, some other people, some board members and the like, and I asked them that question. And they kept coming back to accountability. And the way that they said accountability works for them is that they identify how well the students are doing periodically, check in on them. If they see that a student is having trouble moving off track, they have an immediate intervention with that particular student where they bring in everybody that that student deals with, including the teachers they've had up to that point and the teacher that the student has now currently. And they try to figure out how they can get that student back on track. When I try to sort of pin them down as to whether there might be a cost associated with that, sort of the stick as opposed to the carrot, they wouldn't go that far. They didn't say that they were there to get people in trouble. They're not there to punish the teacher if the student isn't doing well. But they are trying to get at the central core that we've been struggling with in education, which is the rapid nature, how quick we all are to distance ourselves from the educational product. And that is that teachers see it as a very sensitive spot, a very sensitive subject, to hold them accountable for how well their students are doing. Now, in the real world, I'm accountable for the stuff that I put out. If I write columns that are not truthful, not accurate, if there's lots of misspellings, if they need lots of corrections, if they're boring, trite, and predictable, I won't have a job. And most of you have supervisors, you have benchmarks, you have goals, you have a sense of what you have to accomplish. If you go to the local district attorney's office, you'll see that they have cases and they keep track of conviction rates, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're a chief of police, they keep track of, say, the crime rate in your city. And so education has sort of gotten along these many years as saying they're the one sort of world, the one element of the world where that doesn't apply. Where if a teacher keeps producing bad students, there are always sets of excuses. Well, what do you expect me to do? They come from a poor background, they come from the wrong part of town, they come from an African American or Latino population that doesn't value education, et cetera, et cetera. There's always another excuse. What they're doing at Sanger Unified is cutting through those excuses and saying, look, we're not here to bust anybody, we're not here to get your dander up, but we need to fix this problem. And what accountability looks like is a sense of what does this kid need, what are they missing, how do we give it to them? And I can only tell you that's different. This is the same school district I went through, and they didn't have that back then. There wasn't that sort of, I saw it as comparable when I was first told about it. I saw it as comparable to what they do at the NYPD in terms of the CompStat program. Those of you may know that in terms of law enforcement, where they do, there used to be a time where if you had crime in a city, they just sort of make excuses and nobody was responsible and nobody did anything. And then William Bratton, under Giuliani, came forward with a CompStat program that said that you're going to have this computerized program that can keep track of the crime that was committed the night before. So when you come in the morning, they have the chart and it shows that there were these crimes that were committed last night. And they pop up in certain sectors. And every assistant chief belongs to a sector. And so the commissioner could say, Chief Smith, Assistant Chief Smith, this is your sector, these are the crimes that were committed last night. You have to tell me what you're going to do about it, right? And it made those guys really uncomfortable. Like, wait a minute. Because they were getting all this money, but nobody ever held them accountable for anything. This sort of focused them in to say, this is your sector, you're responsible. So when I heard about what Sanger Unified was doing, I was struck by that being a positive thing. That's what accountability looks like. Now that's a practical example. For me, accountability is simple. It's just stop making excuses. Stop making excuses. If you feel that there's some students that you can't teach, you shouldn't be a teacher. Because I'm not paying you to educate the kids who are already driven, self-motivated, self-starters. I tell people all the time, I graduated from high school with 96 A's on my high school transcript and 22 A pluses and 6 AP courses. And I was the kid who did 5 hours of homework and fell asleep at my desk. You could put any teacher in front of me. They didn't have to teach me. They only had to aim me, and I took off like a rocket. Okay? Teachers line up to take responsibility and credit for people like me. But all those kids who were circles, ooh, wait a minute. Those kids who were circles who didn't do so well, that's not my fault. I didn't have anything to do with that. They come from communities that don't value education. They have parents who don't value education. Their parents couldn't read to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Excuses, excuses, excuses. To my mind, accountability starts with putting an end to excuses. Yes? I should say, before I get to the next question, I wrote a column recently that got me into trouble with some teachers, not surprisingly. Because I don't know how many of you saw the Time magazine covers recently. I'm a teacher and I'm a public school teacher in America and. So there was these 3 covers in Time magazine that said, I'm a public school teacher in America, and I have 4 degrees and I've been teaching for 20 years, but I have to sell blood plasma to pay my bills and things, right? And so I thought about that, and there were a whole series of things, how bad teachers had it. And I thought about that, and I wrote a column that said, look, if you don't, teaching isn't about the money, any more than being a journalist is about the money, I assure you. I find it hard to feel sorry for teachers who chose to be a teacher, who stuck it out to be a teacher, who liked certain aspects of their job, like having union protection, a guaranteed pension when many of their friends and neighbors have 401ks, having 3 months off in the summer. They like that part of the job, but they always gripe about not being paid more money. And I feel sorry, I find it difficult to feel sorry for them because they chose that job. I said, nobody put a gun to their head. If they want to quit tomorrow and go make more money doing something else, they can. And I said that from the point of view of me, okay? I have 2 Harvard roommates who went on to get advanced degrees. One went to the law school and went to the business school. I went on to the County School of Government. It has a component in there for journalism. Those 2 roommates make $500,000 a year each. I don't. Okay? I chose this job. I chose this job. I love my job. But I find it hard to get people, including my roommates, to feel sorry for me when I volunteered for this duty. You see? And I challenge my teachers who are readers to explain to me the difference. Explain to me why you're different. Explain to me why I should feel sorry for you for being an underpaid teacher if you don't feel sorry for me for being an underpaid journalist. Yes?
I'm trying to formulate a question, but I guess one question that I have, because I happen to have graduated from Yale in 1993, and I grew up in the South Bronx, and I remember going back home during breaks, and I no longer was my name, I was called Yale.
Yale.
As a way of kind of differentiating and kind of separating me from them, and this...
You could have been called worse, you know?
Totally, and I was. This is a PG space. Certainly that was a nice one. But the thing was I always had this overwhelming desire to, like you said earlier, about what happens when you go back home.
Right.
And who are you when you're back home? And sometimes the challenge of being rejected by the very people that you have a connection to. And so I'm just wondering your experience in that, and what allowed you to continue to care even in the midst of perhaps being around people who couldn't understand and kind of alienated you perhaps, and
right.
how does that work, and what kind of supports do you think are valuable for those who are the ones who are graduating
Right.
and doing well in school and testing well, but are kind of pushed away because they're smart?
Right. Right. So, back in that summer of '88 when I worked for the College Board and I came to ETS, I lived with a friend of mine who went to Yale, a lot of friends who went to Yale. And he and I lived in New York together. We subletted a place near Columbia, up near Amsterdam and 119, I think. So anyway, we're up there. And there was a bit of history that had occurred up there in Morningside Park many years, or not that many, a few years earlier, and it was a police shooting involving a young man named Edmund Perry. Okay? You Google that name. This was a tragic story of a young African American who had gone through ABC, a better chance, the ABC program, and had gotten into Stanford. And before he went to Stanford, he had already experienced during his time, he was at Phillips Exeter. He was a student at Phillips Exeter, then he'd got into Stanford. The only problem with that scenario is eventually you have to go home. If you only go to Phillips Exeter and then you go to Stanford and you don't have to go home for the summer, you don't feel what you say you felt. You don't feel what I felt, right? It's like Ruben graduates, he goes to Harvard, then he goes into graduate school, and he never comes home again. He spends his summers in Boston, his summers in New York. But the minute you go home for the summer and you start palling around with the old friends again, that alienation is a thing, it's a real thing, okay? And you get told, you know, you're just acting white, you get told you're no longer part of the neighborhood. And there was a book that I read about Edmund Perry, and it did say that he, as a teenager, was experiencing these forms of alienation. Eventually, he is tragically shot and killed before he can make it to Stanford. If you want to read the book, it's called Best Intentions by Robert Sam Anson, an important journalist from the day. But in any case, it spoke to me because during my years at Harvard, there was likewise an individual that I went to school with who was part of the 35 that I talked about, 35 Mexican-American kids, who likewise had gotten into trouble, in this case gotten into trouble with the law, had confessed to and been found guilty of a series of armed robberies back home in California during his summers home, and had been convicted and went to prison. And he was a friend of mine, and I wrote about him, and it was my very first column many, many years ago, 2,000 columns ago, was about him. And it was for the Los Angeles Times. I was 21 years old. So these things are all sort of coming in on me, right? And I'm in New York, and there's Morningside Park, and Edmund Perry, and my friend, and it's all coming in on me. And I run across a book. I run across a book about the same period of my life called Hunger of Memory that many educators know. And it's written by Richard Rodriguez, who's a very gifted essayist. And it's about this idea of alienation. It's about how you can't go home again. That the elite university education changes you in a way that makes it difficult for you to go home again. I didn't want to accept that. I just thought that was the most offensive idea I've ever heard because I was homesick. And this idea somehow that I was going to stay in Cambridge for the rest of my life, I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I can't wait for graduation. I am leaving on the next plane out. I'm not staying here. And so the idea somehow that I couldn't go home again, I found very troubling. So what I did when I read that book, in addition to striking up a correspondence with Rodriguez that ended up propelling me into this writing career, was I tried to prove him wrong. And so I tried to prove him wrong in my own life by doing things like making it a point to go home again. And the most dramatic thing I did to try to prove Richard wrong was that I took a year off from college. Now let me just bear with me for a second here. I had friends, okay, all right. We have a small population of Latino students at Harvard. We also have a small population of African American students at Harvard. If we were all at a big state school in California, there would be a significant number of each of those populations that we could go off and segregate ourselves and never deal with each other. At Harvard, you don't have the luxury. You're all tossed together. When I was at Harvard, there were 25% of the entire population was minority, 75% white. You factor in the Asian population into the 25%, you're talking about a really tiny percentage of African Americans and Latinos. Got it? So I would be walking through campus on a snowy day with sleet hitting me in the face, thinking, what the hell am I doing here? I should have gone to Stanford. It's warmer there. Walking up, and an African American student would be coming the other direction, who I didn't know. I had plenty of African American friends. But one who I didn't know. He'd see me, I'd see him, and we'd nod. Just on sight, okay? A nod. You're different, I'm different, right? You feeling a little alienated? Me too. And so some of my African American friends decided to do something dramatic. They took a year off from school, and instead of going off to, where all my classmates were going to London and Paris and wherever, they decided to enroll as a visiting student at black colleges, traditionally, historically black colleges. A good friend of mine to this day, Jennifer, went to Spelman. A good friend of mine, Jay, to this day, went to Howard. Other people went to Morehouse. That's what they did. I looked at that and I said, I want to do that too. But there is no traditional Hispanic college. What there is, however, is the state college where I'm from. In the middle of California, California State University, Fresno State. Where my dad went when he was working he was a cop. He went to night school there. Where a lot of my friends and relatives went. And where it was always assumed that I would go. And it's mostly Hispanic. So I went there. And I enrolled there for a year. So I was a Harvard student taking courses at Fresno State. I was taking Chicano courses, Chicano Latino Studies courses, 4 and 4. I took 8 of them. I was working during the day. And that was my experience. And when it was over, I went back to Harvard and graduated. So I went to Harvard. I majored in American history. If I had to wait around for Harvard to come up with a course in Mexican American history at Harvard, I'd still be there waiting. Okay? So what I had to do was learn American history at Harvard, all of the curriculum that they taught me, the Constitution from Bernard Bailyn and everything else, right? But when I wanted this extra thing, this spicy sauce, I had to go get it in California. So I put the two together. I can't tell you the reaction I get when I go back to speak now at Fresno State. They don't care so much about Harvard, but when I tell them I was a student there, they all start clapping, right? So that's a long way of answering your question, that for me, this was a real thing. This alienation about being separated from your home was a real thing. And I felt the way to confront it was to go back in there and really try to have my cake and eat it too, right? Now that wasn't a complete fix, but it helped me at the time. Little did you know you were getting an answer like that.
Thank you.
Complicated answer.
Good morning. So I wanted to ask you, pick your brain on something. You mentioned, because I have 2 children as well, and
Yes.
they were born here, as was I.
How old are they?
10 and 11.
Oh man, you're in the middle of it.
So my daughter is 11-year-old, a proud young Latina woman, little girl, and she'll tell you. And she reads on history and reads out, her mom's Puerto Rican, I'm Ecuadorian descent. And she identifies, when you ask her, or her friends are all asking, so what are you? What are you?
Right.
She'll identify as Latina. I'm either Ecuadorian or Puerto Rican, or she says both. How do your children, when they were asking you, dad is American, mom is Mexican, what do your children identify as? You know, as we're growing, and I guess you want to keep that culture strong and their history strong.
Yes.
They're American, basically, but they are so Latinos.
Yes. So, good question. Here's one thing I learned that I don't think my parents ever figured out. My parents were busy working. My parents were young parents, right? My dad was a parent at 25, at 26. We were kind of all growing up together. I'm an older parent. And one thing I think that I learned from my wife that my parents didn't know, when you have 3 kids, or you have 2 kids, you have two daughters. When you have 2 or 3 kids, anything more than 1, you learn right away that your kids are different. Your kids are Mars and Venus different, okay? They came from the same womb, raised in the same house, but they are different, right? And the more kids you have, the more you see the difference. And they're different every single way. And they're different how they learn. You know, my son is enrolled in public schools. He's a public school kid in 6th grade. And he wanted to be a public school kid. My 2 daughters go to a charter school with a homeschool component, okay? My son did not like the idea of homeschool at all, right? He likes and needs rules and structure, and he gets it at public school. So they learn differently. To your question, they also relate to how they identify themselves differently. So my 3 kids, if you ask them, at least one will say, I'm Mexican. One will probably say, I'm Mexican American. My oldest 13-year-old will say, I'm Mexican American. And then one sort of has a play on it that says, I'm not Mexican, you know, because he does that, he or she, my son, does that to get under my wife's skin, right? Because my wife is Mexican. And so she speaks perfect Spanish, and she'll say, you know, tell me something in Spanish. And he'll be like, I'm not speaking to you in Spanish. You know, I'm not Mexican. But he understands what she's saying. So there's this kind of thing going on with them. But yeah, all 3 of them relate to their ethnicity differently. I predict that this will evolve over time. In high school, they will have it differently, and in college, they'll have it differently. And when they're in their early 20s, if you ask them that same question, they'll have different answers to it. It's certainly true in the case of my brother and sister. We all came from the same household in Central California. My sister is the least Hispanic of the three of us. My brother is perhaps the most. Works in that space, lived in East Los Angeles around that component. Even though I write about the subject a lot, I'm sort of a hybrid. So anyway, yeah, different, and they're all different. And that's gonna be one way is I hope they all grow up proud of their heritage, but they also have to grow up proud of being an American and knowing that part of their component. My wife is strictly Mexican, and so if she jabs at me every once in a while, she jabs at me because I'm an American. Either because we're watching the news and there'll be some protests in Mexico City. This happened years ago, and we turn on the television, there's 500,000 people protesting in the Zocalo of Mexico City against the government. And I said, I don't understand. I said, why don't these people just get together, petition their government and vote the guy out? And she looked at me, she goes, man, you're such an American. They taught you about John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, and you think the government actually works for the people. What are you, crazy? In Mexico, you try saying that, you will disappear. They won't just find you for 50 years, So she does tease me. She'll say, exactly, now tell me again, after 15 years of marriage, what part of you is Mexican? Or she'll say, what kind of Mexican are you? And I'll say, the American kind. Anything else? Yes.
They have just answered my question. The question that I had for you was one around the kind of optimism. So when I hear your message, I hear a message of optimism. I hear that, if there is high expectations from your parents, you're a student and you work hard, and then you're surrounded by educators who hold themselves accountable, that, that's the recipe.
Right.
And so that assumes a certain amount of optimism, that given that all of these pieces hold together, that the outcome would be, a positive one.
Right.
So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, especially in this particular climate, around the sense of optimism in the Latino community, given that, the right things happen, that the right outcome will happen as well.
It's a very good question. Thank you, very good question. I should say that I'm glad you pointed that out, because I hadn't seen my message that way, but I am very optimistic because of everything I said. And it's weird for me because I normally write about, as I said, media, politics, and immigration. In those three areas, I'm very pessimistic. In those three areas, I don't think we're going to see an immigration reform deal in my lifetime. I think both political parties are pretty much the same, two heads on the same snake. Very difficult to tell them apart. Neither one serves the people very well. And the media is completely broken, biased, and corrupt. So there I am, right? So I'm very cynical with regard to those three things. But then there's education. And I hadn't realized until you said that. That's exactly right. Everything I feel about education is very optimistic. I still feel that there's a lot of hope for people being able to do the right thing and have the right outcome. And maybe that's ultimately because, unlike those three things, where there's a lot of power in other people's hands, over your immigration status, what happens to you, over your politics, certainly, you don't get the feeling that you have a voice in the US Senate, right? Or in media. Who runs CNN? Who runs Fox News? They're not asking for my opinion. So those things are all run by other people that I have no control over. But here, in education, I have a lot of control as a parent, right? Every single day I see that in my kids. If I ride herd over my kid to make sure that my kids are doing their homework, put down the video game, right? We all know that. I'm speaking to the choir now, but when you think about the number one thing working against us as parents, this thing, right? Anything with an on switch. It's the reason we call this iGen. From 5 years old on, every single kid, be it a phone, an iPad, whatever, I'm constantly competing with these things. And I just want my kids to say, You know, if you spend 5 hours on this thing, I want you to spend 6 hours reading. And I want the proportion to be that, right? So as a parent, I have a lot more control. That's where I get my sense of optimism. Okay? All I have to sacrifice is I have to say, well, I'm not gonna be my kid's favorite person, right? I'm gonna be a little bit of a hard ass, but that's okay because I'm the dad. But in terms of the Latino community as a whole, I think they do likewise register very optimistically. And they have no illusions about anything. They see the political system in full. They know that there are people out there who want to make them into scapegoats. They hear very loud and clear when a presidential candidate calls them criminals and rapists and murderers and drug dealers. But they also look to the other political party and they don't see a bunch of people who are ready to save them if it means sticking their neck out. So they have a very realistic view of what's coming at them, but they also have a real sense that they're not going to be held captive to that and they can still succeed. That they can be successful and their kids can be successful, and they define the kid's success very simply. One day my kid's gonna have soft hands and work in an office in air conditioning. He's not gonna work out in the fields, right? He's not gonna work in this terrible back-breaking job. He's gonna be paid, you know, differently and higher rate, all these things. They see that, and they see that that formula will work no matter who the president is, no matter who runs the Congress, no matter what they say about them, that kind of power that they have will override anything that comes at them. That's a really powerful message. And you know this because this has been true in the African American community and the Latino community for generations. We have succeeded despite the fact that there are a lot of people out there in both political parties who have not wanted us to succeed. So that's good. We don't wait around for the phone call.
One last question, and then we're going to have some closing remarks from Sylvia.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Navarrete, for accepting our invitation and joining us today. I can't think of a better way to close this Hispanic Heritage Month events here at ETS than your presentation.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoy it. Let's give him another applause.